You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
ChatGPT Plus is free for college students through May. Here's the thing. You've got a lot to do between now and then. Studying for finals, writing papers, trying to keep your life on track. And ChatGPT can help with all of it. It can quiz you for your econ exam, make a study guide from your French notes, plan out your meals and study breaks. It can get really specific on how you like to learn. It can even help you come up with ways to stop procrastinating. So from now until summer break, take advantage of all the ways ChatGPT can make your life easier. Restrictions apply.
Lights, camera, innovation. Walt Disney Studios chose advanced 5G solutions from T-Mobile for Business to transform the movie-making process. Together, we kept a remote production hub in Hawaii in sync with a team in California to bring Lilo and Stitch to theaters this summer. This is picture-perfect collaboration. This is Walt Disney Studios with T-Mobile for Business. Take your business further at T-Mobile.com/now.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 216, The Battle Before Britain Part 8, Operation Catapult. This week, a big thank you goes out to Kevin for the donation on Buy Me a Coffee, and Deadballing, Bregand, Gawal, James, and Christopher for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. When the French and German armistice went into effect in late June 1940, and France ended its resistance to the German invasion, there were many questions and concerns that were being asked in London about what it meant for the future state of the war. There were many large questions about how Britain would fight the war, which will be a topic for a future episode, but there were also questions about the future of what remained of the French military. The most immediate concern, at least among British leaders, was the status of the French fleet. The only theater of the war where it was clear that the British had an advantage was at sea. The Royal Navy had its own problems, but it was still clearly superior in power to the German Kriegsmarine, particularly during 1940, when U-boat numbers were low and the Bismarck-class battleships were not yet available. But the Royal Navy was also spread thin between the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, with the entry of Italy into the war in June causing many additional problems. The French Navy was similar in size and power to the Italians, and if it were used by the Germans, it could tip the scales of the war at sea. Part of the armistice that had been signed was that the French fleet retained its independence and would not be surrendered to the Germans, and the British leaders had been assured by Admiral Darlan himself that he would prevent French ships from being used by Germany. But it was still a threat. In early July 1940, after much discussion, the British War Cabinet informed the Admiralty that it would need to plan and execute an operation with the goal of disabling and destroying as much of the French fleet as possible. The goal was to end the risk that it could pose to British interests, regardless of what it did for future Franco-British relations. This operation would be codenamed Operation Catapult. Operation Catapult is widely criticized in histories of this part of the war, with the well-regarded historian Robert Forczyk stating, quote, "Operation Catapult was an idiotic display of military force and represented the nadir of British strategy in World War II," end quote. While its roots were in concern for what could happen with the French fleet, there was also influence that Churchill and others like him had at this stage of the war. One of the central pillars of Churchill's beliefs on military strategy was that aggressive actions were what would win the war. This would be showcased many times throughout both world wars, and also in many of the ideas that he had that did not end up happening. For example, Operation Catherine, which would have seen the Royal Navy go hard charging into the Baltic, was one of his proposals that was shot down due to the risks involved. The pillar of the importance of action was one of the justifications for the attacks on the French fleet, as there would never be a better time to attack them due to the fact that most of the French ships were in port due to the armistice, and in some cases were positioned with elements of the Royal Navy. And even if the French had given their word and had gotten the word of the Germans that the fleet would not be used, there was a real question as to whether or not the French would have the power to make good on that promise, even if they needed to. All of this resulted in the unanimous decision of the British War Cabinet to either force the French fleet to surrender to the Royal Navy or to destroy them. The orders were given to the Admiralty with a deadline of just 3 days to put a plan into action. It would not be a strictly surprise operation, though, and instead each piece of the scattered French fleet would be given the opportunity to surrender when presented with an ultimatum, and only if and when this was rejected would attacks actually take place against French ships. The most important, and to history the most well-known, piece of Operation Catapult would involve the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir, which was a naval base in Algeria. A major part of the French fleet, including most of its capital ships, had been sent to Algeria during the armistice discussions with the Germans, and they had stayed there as a new base away from direct German influence. Given the general strength of these elements of the French fleet, the Royal Navy would send a force that included the battlecruiser Hood, 2 additional battleships, and the aircraft carrier Ark Royal to take care of this part of the operation. On the morning of July 3rd, the British destroyer HMS Foxhound, carrying a former British naval attaché who had been stationed in Paris, entered the port to request an interview with the French commander. When the meeting began, he was presented with an ultimatum with 4 possible outcomes. He could join his fleet to the Royal Navy to continue the war against Germany and Italy. He could request internment in a British-controlled port. He could take his ships and sail them to French territories in the Caribbean, where they would be well outside of German influence, or he could scuttle his ships. The French admiral Jean Soult did not feel that he could make this decision on his own, and therefore, as soon as the ultimatum was delivered, he contacted French naval headquarters. He was only able to get a hold of Admiral Darlan's chief of staff, but they both agreed that the only option available was to reject the terms of the ultimatum and resist the British attack by force. Jean Soult would later defend these actions by saying that he was merely trying to uphold the honor of the French Navy, even if he did not believe that his resistance would meaningfully change the outcome for his ships. Just a few hours after the ultimatum was delivered, Jean Soult would send out a message to all of the French ships under his command. Quote, "English fleet has proposed unacceptable armistice. Be prepared to answer force with force." End quote. The British admiral on the scene, Somerville, would then delay the consequences of the French denial for several hours, hoping that they would change their mind. Then at 5:15 p.m., the final orders for the attack were sent out, and no further delay was possible because it would soon be nightfall, and it was unacceptable for the attack to be delayed until the following day. After moving into position, at precisely 5:54 p.m. local time, the British ships opened fire, with the larger ships sitting at a range of about 16 kilometers or 10 miles. All of the British capital ships were armed with 15-inch guns, and during the 10 minutes that followed, they would fire 150 shells between them, all of which would land in the harbor area. The French ships, still stationary and not at all positioned to resist a surface action, could do little in response. The French battleship Bretagne was hit almost immediately, with the shell detonating in the magazines, which was almost always a fatal blow for any large warship. 977 French sailors would be lost when she capsized just after 6 p.m. The Provence, Bretagne's sister ship, was also hit, with the result being fire and flooding, but the captain of that ship was at least able to beach the vessel before it sunk too far into the water. The newer battleship Dunkirk was hit by 4 shells and also had to be beached. Another battleship, the Strasbourg, would actually be able to get underway and make an escape, moving across the Mediterranean to the French port of Toulon. Several other smaller French ships were also damaged by the British action, but most importantly, 1,297 French sailors were killed and 350 were wounded, with the British suffering 4 casualties, 2 killed and 2 wounded. Mers el-Kebir was not the only collection of French ships that would be given an ultimatum on July 3rd, and in Alexandria the situation was even more tense. At the Egyptian port of Alexandria, 8 French ships, 1 battleship, 3 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 3 destroyers had been based with a Royal Naval Squadron for operations in the eastern Mediterranean. The French admiral in command of the fleet at Alexandria was presented with a very similar ultimatum to the one delivered to Jean Soult in Mers el-Kebir, but in Alexandria he chose a different option. They were surrounded by Royal Navy ships in Alexandria, and so the only real choice was to surrender the ships. Even though their ships were surrendered to the British, the French naval officers and men would not serve alongside the Royal Navy Squadron until May 1943, after the Allied landings in North Africa had completely altered the internal politics of Vichy France, and the momentum had clearly shifted towards the Free French government led by de Gaulle. On July 7th, the last piece of Operation Catapult would take place near the West African port of Dakar, where the incomplete French battleship Richelieu had been sent for safety. Here, the Royal Navy would send in swordfish planes from the aircraft carrier Hermes, armed with torpedoes, to attack the French ship. One of the torpedoes would find its target and immobilize the Richelieu, although it was repairable, and thankfully, during this attack, there would be no loss of life. Overall, the objectives of Operation Catapult were achieved. The majority of the strength of the French Navy, particularly in the form of capital ships, was either damaged or destroyed by the British attacks. But even at the time, many of the participants did not like what they were doing, and in some ways the operation was counterproductive. Admiral Somerville, who had commanded the British ships that had participated in the largest attack at Mers el Kabir, would write that it was, quote, the biggest political blunder of modern times. The British attack would also cause the French to reconcentrate all of their remaining naval strength back in French ports, where they could be better protected, but that also put them at a much greater risk of being captured by German forces should they desire to do so. With the benefit of hindsight, we also know that these attacks were completely unnecessary. As much fear as there might have been in London about the French ships being captured and turned over to the Germans, the French captains had clear instructions straight from Darlan that they were to scuttle their ships if the Germans ever attempted to take them, no matter what. Operation Catapult also completely destroyed whatever relationship the leaders of Vichy France had with the British government, with the Vichy leaders taking the step to officially end relations with Britain on July 5th. On a slightly longer-term view, the operation may also have been counterproductive because it created enemies among the leadership of the French Navy. These were the same men that were best positioned to boost the cause of the nascent Free French movement that de Gaulle was trying to get going with British support at this time. The greatest possible outcome for de Gaulle was for Free France to gain access to the French fleet, the one thing that could have an immediate impact on the war. And now that same French fleet was either destroyed or had been attacked by the Royal Navy, and every leader of that fleet and many of the sailors were now strong enemies of the British cause.
Clorox Sentiva smells like lavender. Cleans like Clorox. And feels like...
All right, that could go on for a while. Experience the long-lasting freshness of Clorox Sentiva. Available in Clorox Sentiva Lavender Scented Bleach. Use as directed.
This episode is brought to you by Netflix. 3 couples, 4 vacations, a lot to unpack. Watch The 4 Seasons, a new series starring comedy favorites Tina Fey, Steve Carell, Will Forte, Coleman Domingo, and more in a hilarious and heartfelt love letter to long-term relationships. Based on the original Alan Alda film. Watch The 4 Seasons, streaming now only on Netflix.
The status of the French fleet would be just one of many topics that would be discussed by the War Cabinet during the summer of 1940. From the very beginning of the war in 1939, the Kriegsmarine had been working to expand the war into the oceans of the world, and those actions demanded quick and decisive responses from the British. One of the areas that was critical was actually the waters right around the British home islands, which was the domain of Coastal Command. Coastal Command was an arm of the Royal Air Force that had been created to defend the waters around the home islands before the war, and they would prove to be almost completely incapable of doing so. Like many other areas of the British military, they had suffered from a lack of funding, particularly due to the fact that they were far from the RAF's priority during their rearmament years. Most importantly, they were unable to actually launch attacks against the greatest threat to British shipping near the coasts, U-boats. This was critical because Britain was a maritime nation to its very core, and that did not just mean trade overseas, but also the movement of goods and people around Britain. While there were roads and railways, often the most efficient way to get goods from, for example, Scotland to England, or the other way around, was actually to load it on a small transport ship, move it north, and then unload it. To pull a quote from Battle of Britain by James Holland, quote, "Britain depended on coal. It was the lifeblood of the power stations which provided the electricity so that aircraft and almost every other war requirement could be made. The South Coast alone needed as an absolute necessity some 40,000 tons of coal a week. Without coal, Britain would collapse." Yet the inland transport network, the underdeveloped road system, and the railway network simply could not cope with the demands that would be needed were the coastal convoys to stop. Despite the considerable threat from S-boats and U-boats, from the Luftwaffe and from mines, the colliers and trampers would have to keep going. End quote. This was the trade that the U-boats, particularly smaller U-boats, would target after the start of the war, and the Avro Ansons of Coastal Command, who had the job of patrolling those waters, could do little against them. The problem was, the Ansons did not have what the British called an underwater bomb, which had been ordered in 1934 for the very purpose of attacking German submarines, but it had never been tested in anything like real conditions, and it would prove to be completely useless. And it would not be until the end of 1939 that real work on finding an alternative would begin. The purpose-designed 250-pound depth charge, which would be dropped from the air, would not actually be introduced until 1941, at which point Coastal Command could start actually attacking submarines, instead of just hopefully finding them and then trying to vector other resources in to launch an attack. Coastal Command was far from useless, though, and the aircraft did have an effect. And as the Royal Navy improved its anti-submarine capabilities in the first year of the war, the sighting reports from Coastal Command became more and more valuable. By the end of 1940, the U-boats were rarely venturing within 500 kilometers of the British coastline, specifically because of the risk of being spotted from the air was too high. While the coastal areas were important, the war on overseas trade was seen as the pivotal area for action for the German Navy. These actions are largely outside the scope of this specific podcast series, and will receive much greater focus in later episodes of the podcast. But even at this early stage of the war, the events surrounding British trade were a critical part of the overall story of the war in the summer of 1940. If you look into the archives of the British War Cabinet, you'll find an endless series of reports on what was happening in the Maritime War and how much shipping had been lost, week after week, for the entire war. In May 1940, over 200,000 tons had been lost. In June, it was over 500,000. This meant that while the French and British armies seemed to be falling apart, much the same seemed to be happening on the trade lanes. Worst of all at this time, the British were also losing the war of attrition at sea, as the British merchant fleet had only received 1.5 million tons of new shipping capacity since the start of the war, but during that same time, 2.1 million tons had been sunk. If that trend continued over a long enough time frame, then it was possible that the shipping capacity would simply no longer exist to maintain required imports. Every possible action was taken to turn this trend around. At shipbuilding firms, the greatest possible priority was given to convoy escorts, while Royal Navy ships were being distributed to convoys to try and turn back the German surface raiders. But there was a balancing act that had to be maintained as long as there was a realistic threat of a German invasion. The strength of the Royal Navy was a key part of any British anti-invasion plans, but that meant that they had to be in position at the time of the invasion. There was nothing a destroyer could do to ward off an invasion if it was escorting a convoy south of Iceland when the German invasion force arrived. But if that destroyer wasn't south of Iceland, then maybe a convoy would be attacked by a U-boat, and more ships would go to the bottom of the ocean. The only solution was to build more convoy escorts, and these efforts would begin to pay off over the course of 1940 and into 1941. There would still be great periods of threat from German surface raiders, both military ships as well as converted civilian ships in the form of auxiliary cruisers, but they were never numerous enough to stop trade. The naval vessels would be hunted to the maximum ability of the Royal Navy, a practice that culminated in the sinking of the Bismarck in May 1941. And in terms of U-boats, there were just never enough of them, and this created a situation during the early war years where the Germans could pulse U-boats into the trade lanes, but there were not enough U-boats available to keep a sizable number in the trade lanes over a long time span. So there would be months of great U-boat victories, and then downtimes as most of the German underwater fleet rotated back to port to refit and rearm. For his part, the commander of the German U-boat fleet, Admiral Dönitz, was pushing for as many U-boats as possible, but building up the fleet took time, and there would be periods of 1939 and 1940 where the balance of U-boats was actually negative, with the production of new U-boats not making up for those lost in action and accidents. But the U-boats were not the only problem, and during the summer of 1940, there were times when the U-boats were almost matched by a combination of German surface ships, aircraft, and mines. With mines being the sort of hidden, silent killer that was so impactful on the course of trade during this time. But all of these efforts combined would never be able to sustain the level of British losses that would be required to truly change the outcome of the war, even if during the summer of 1940 the situation seemed pretty bleak for British trade. And the problem for the British is that the sinkings weren't the only problem. They were bad. You didn't like losing ships, you didn't like losing men, you didn't like losing the goods that were on those ships. But they were having other problems caused by the war that were just as important. The convoy requirement and the routing of convoys into safer waters meant just generally a slower movement of trade than what was possible in peacetime. Then the disruption of goods due to German air attacks and invasion preparations meant that there was a growing number of ships in British ports that were waiting to be unloaded. There was also a growing backlog of vital repairs that had to be done on merchant ships to keep them moving, which created a maintenance backlog that would have to be worked through. These problems would require administrative work to resolve, but everything was placed at a lower priority during the summer of 1940 because of one unavoidable problem. It appeared that the Germans were planning to launch an invasion. This invasion, which would be given the name Operation Sea Lion, will be the focus of the next part of the Battle of Britain series, as the Germans tried to determine how to launch, by far, the largest amphibious invasion in history, while the British tried to determine how they can best resist that amphibious invasion. Thank you for listening, and I hope you will join me next week as we begin discussing the next phase of the Battle of Britain.